one of the things that I've been struck by, and this is actually one of the criticisms I have of the psychoanalysts and the clinicians in general, even though I have great admiration for them and would say that what they have to say is very much worth listening to, is that it's not obvious that your personality is inside you. You know, you think, you know, a human being is a strange multi-level thing, and you might ask yourself, well, for example, you know, is your mother more a part of you than your arm? Or maybe even more precisely, is your child more a part of you than your arm? I mean, certainly people will do drastically self-sacrificing things to maintain the lives of their children. And so you're a person, and you're made out of all sort of subcomponents of a person, none of which you can see when you look at a person, all the complicated machinery inside you that makes you who you are. And then outside of that, of course, you're nested in all sorts of complex systems. So you're part of a family, and you're part of a community, and that's part of a province, and that's part of a state, and that's part of an international consortium of states, and that's part of an ecosystem. And how you make a distinction between you and the systems that you're embedded in is also of extraordinary difficulty. And one of the things that you have to do as a clinical psychologist, for example, if you're trying to diagnose someone with depression, you think, well, this person's dreadfully unhappy. Well, you can think about that as a problem with their psychological adjustment, you know, the way that they're looking at the world. But if you look at the epidemiological literature, for example, one of the things that you find is that very many people have a first depressive episode after something genuinely terrible has happened to them, right? They've lost someone, or they've become injured, or they've become unemployed, because unemployment is a terrible shock to people. And it's not precisely self-evident that you can consider someone who's unhappy and desperate because they no longer have a job depressed. They're certainly sad and they're not doing very well, but the fact that they no longer have an income is actually something with dramatic practical consequences, and treating that as if it's a mental disorder seems to be counterproductive. It's also the case, for example, that if someone comes into you to talk to you and they're very upset, and they may manifest the signs of, say, an anxiety disorder, or again depression, or other clinical features for that matter, you have to do a careful analysis of their manner in which they're embedded in their family, because, and this is something that we'll talk about quite thoroughly when we come to discussing Freud, is that, well, you know, it's not like everybody's families are necessarily particularly happy places to be. You know, I mean, human beings are very dependent. We have a very long period of dependency, partly because we're so cortically hyper-developed. It takes a very long time to program us into something that's vaguely capable of maneuvering on its own, and that produces, of course, the very tight familial bonds that we all desperately require, because who wants to be alone in the world? But it also exposes us to the probability of becoming entangled into even multi-generational family pathology. And it isn't obvious always, and certainly hasn't been to me when I've seen my clients, that the fundamental problem with the client is the client. Sometimes the fundamental problem is the family. And perhaps that person has been identified as the problem person. It's rather convenient for everyone who's involved to make that presupposition. It's also the case that, this is the Freudian idea fundamentally, this is the Oedipal idea, that it's very easy for people to become over-dependent on their parents, and for the parents to facilitate that, and then for the primary developmental problem for the individual, in fact, to become free of the interfering elements of the family so that they can exist as independent individuals. Well, and then of course there are cultural variations in that make that proposition complex, but that's a fundamental tenet, say, of Freudian psychology. A lot of the clinical psychologists, all of whom that we're going to study, have a pronounced Western orientation. One of the fundamental presuppositions is that part of the hallmark of positive psychological development is the creation of an individual that's capable of acting independently. And that's, I would say, an implicit ideal that lurks at the bottom of the clinical presuppositions of all the theorists that are classic psychologists. So that's a very old picture. It's Jonah emerging from the whale. It's a variant of a myth. The myth is the dragon myth, I suppose. The dragon myth is that there's a dragon that lives under the ground that's eternal, and now and then it rises out of the ground to threaten the state, and someone within the state determines to go confront the dragon voluntarily and does so, and then brings back something of great value. Sometimes if the hero is generally male, sometimes the thing of great value is a female that the dragon has kidnapped. That's a St. George story. And sometimes it's gold and other treasure, like in the story of the Hobbit, and a story that you all know very well. It's a classic hero story, and the hero story is another fundamental element of the clinical theories, I would say. It's predicated on the idea that you learn through voluntary contact with that frightens or disgusts you. And that's a hallmark of psychoanalytic theory. Carl Jung, who we'll discuss in detail, said his primary dictum was insterquilinus invenatur, which I'm sure I'm massacring because it's Latin, but it meant in filth it will be found. And one of the hallmarks of the clinical theories is that within the confines of everyone's experience, and you can think about this as experience out in the world or experience in the unconscious mind, there are dirty little secrets, let's say, and skeletons and dreadful old fears and remnants of abuse and memories of pathological behavior and failures of courage that leave you undeveloped, perhaps out of avoidance, and that the psychoanalytic process is precisely the careful encounter with those forgotten and repressed elements of the self, in the hope that a clear encounter will redeem them, unite them with the remainder of your personality, and make you stronger in consequence. And I would say that that's just a variant of the manner in which human beings learn, and we'll talk about this more in relationship to Piaget, because you always learn when you're wrong, which is very annoying. Now, what do you learn when you're correct? You're walking in the world, you're operating in the world, you have a sense of what you want to have happen. You're always looking at the world through this sense of what you want to have happen. You're acting so that what you want to have happen will happen. And when it happens, well, then you're happy because, well, first of all, you get what you want, and that's good, maybe, depending on what you want. But it's also good because if you get what you want when you act, then it turns out that your model of how to act is valid, right? The outcome, that you get what you want, indicates no error on the part of your model. But it's very frequently the case that when you act to get what you want, you don't get what you want. And then that's unpleasant because you don't get what you want, but it's even more unpleasant because it brings with it the hint of a suggestion that the manner in which you're construing the world is incorrect at some indeterminate level. So for example, if you tell a joke at a party, you presume that people will attend, and then when they hear the joke, they will laugh, and then if you tell the joke and it goes flat, or even worse, disgusts and offends people, then you're going to be taken aback, and that's partly because you didn't get what you want, and that's not so good, but it's more because there's something wrong with the way you conceptualized the situation. And then you're faced with a problem, and the problem is the emergence of a domain of the unknown. It's like, well, what kind of mistake did you make? Maybe you're not as funny as you think you are. That could be a big problem. Maybe you're not around people who are the way you think they are. Maybe they don't like you as much as you thought they liked you. I mean, the potential for various paranoid thoughts of increasing severity to come welling up at you in a situation where you make even a trivial social mistake is quite broad. And when you make an error of that sort, you have to face it and sort through all the possibilities so that you can find out what it was that you did wrong and how to retool it so that in the future you don't make the same mistake. And that requires, well, that requires in some sense what you might describe as a journey into the belly of the beast being that place where things have fallen apart and where you're overwhelmed with negative emotion.